population is expected to grow by 33%. And in order to feed this population, we're going to need about 50% more food and 30% more water by very soon from now, 2030. And climate variability, of course, will exacerbate food and water security. So let's talk about Sonora. So Sonora occupies about 9.4% of the land in Mexico, but it generates only 4% of surface water flows. So now you begin to see the problem. So other states in Mexico have a lot more water than Sonora does, but it's among the top 5 producers of agriculture in Mexico. And it's second in Mexico only to Sinaloa in terms of the percentage of its land under irrigation, partly because of this lack of surface water flow, rainfall. Now, there are many hectares of land under irrigation, and it's 11% of Mexico's total land, irrigated land. So this is the area that I'm talking about. It's closer to the border, that is, San Ignacio is to Nogales, which is the border city. There's Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora. And San Ignacio is near the small city, you would call it, of Magdalena, and then off of the International Highway. And it's located right on the border of this expanding Sonoran desert. Okay? And Rayon is also located along the border, eastern sort of border of the Sonoran desert, and it's located in a valley which is about 2 hours from the capital city of Hermosillo. In San Ignacio, it's located along the Magdalena River. It's one of the main rivers of Sonora. There's 7 major rivers in Sonora. It's an ephemeral river, as many are. Unfortunately, it does not flow throughout the year. Why? Because it's used upstream for the city of Nogales. So there are urban, there are rural to urban diversions of water taking place as it occurs in so many areas. And rural areas are hurt by that. And there's also groundwater pumping along the river, so that these wells are located near the river. And so in San Ignacio, then, the river water is not used directly. Instead, wells are placed near the river, and water is pumped for irrigation there. Spring water is also used because there are numerous springs there, and it's linked to the river hydrologically because the levels in the river depend, and the spring water levels are dependent on that and dependent on rainfall. Wells are also linked to river water levels, and the groundwater levels are in decline due to over-pumping, not only for agriculture but also for diversions to cities. And Nogales, Arizona, and Nogales, Sonora especially, are growing in size. So the next community, Rayon, Sonora, is also located on a river, and it's a tributary of the main river in Sonora, which is the Sonora River. And San Miguel River is also ephemeral. It only flows during the rainy season, which is 2 times a year, during the monsoons and during the winter rains. I'll talk to you a little bit more about the monsoons. And there are wells, like in San Ignacio, they're operated as groups. So you have well societies that are basically used to, in part, to divide up the costs of pumping and well maintenance, and also deepening these wells. Okay, so this is where the Magdalena River is. The Rio Magdalena is closer to the border, and then you see Hermosillo. The Hermosillo is right along the Sonoran River. And the Sonoran River is also diverted, and the San Miguel is affected by that to provide water for the growing city of Hermosillo. Okay, so farming then in Sonora is dependent on rainfall, but not directly. Instead, farming uses, as I said, all of these different sources of water. And it's all linked hydrologically, so the amount of water you find in the springs will depend on how much it rains. And the springs are located close to the rivers. Changes that are occurring in rainfall are significant. Usually the mean annual precipitation has been 400 to 500 millimeters in the San Miguel River sub-watershed. And as I mentioned before, the North American monsoon, as we call it, provides actually up to 70% of Northwest Mexico's and U.S. Southwest annual rainfall. So it's a very important event. It occurs in July and August. And it was something very familiar to me because I had worked in India where we also have a monsoon. But monsoon rains water crops and rangelands for approximately 20 million people along the border, on both sides of the border. A study that is forthcoming predicts that in the future, unfortunately, this very critical monsoon will arrive later. Okay. Why? Because rising temperatures will mean that the soils are more are drier, do not hold as much moisture, and so it will take till the Pacific winds come and bring in moisture to lead to enough moisture in the air in the atmosphere to lead to rainfall. So these two images by Vivoni et al. Show that that's pre-monsoon in June and post-monsoon in September. It shows that during the North American monsoon that it leads to a strong vegetation response. And also you can see that a lot of this is located along rivers. So the darkest green areas is in riparian areas. So this is showing how critical this monsoon is to greening of this area. And it's very important also for agriculture. However, we've been in a multi-year drought in the Northwest Mexico and also Southwest US. And this shows in Nogales where they have a station multi-year drought where we've been below average rainfall. So what I looked at in San Ignacio, and I've been doing research there since 2007, is gendered spaces of production and processing and how these are being basically affected by climate change. So I looked at the home compound, the solar as it's called, and I also looked at home production of canned and candied fruits and pickled vegetables. So I looked at the agricultural production going on in these home compounds where they grow these different fruits and sometimes even vegetables. But I also looked at what do they do with those products, so the production of these into these goods. And it's not the only locus of agricultural production. There are larger orchards in these communities, but where women are more involved is right close to the home, and in some people call them kitchen gardens. And so I looked at that, and I noticed that it was a way, for one thing, for women to combine several different activities, right? They could be cooking the afternoon meal, and also irrigating, for example, right? Or taking care of children, and also, cutting trees, that kind of thing, harvesting even. And it was also a way of getting other family members to be involved in this production. These are the types of things that they produce. So they produce quince paste, quince jelly. Some of you might have had guava jelly, right? It's very similar. So they make it into these hard blocks that you cut, right? And then they also have canned peaches, canned quince jelly, fig jam that they produce. And some of it is sold right from their homes. So they just put up a sign and their neighbors know to come there. And even from Magdalena, they'll come there from the nearest city. And they also, if they have a label, and if they're a larger production facility or enterprise, then they will sell it in, and they need government permission, and it's a whole process to get this label and to get on their quince jelly. Then they can sell to supermarkets. They also sell to vendors who come to their homes, and then these vendors sell along the international highway. So anybody who's been on an international highway will have seen these stands where they're selling these products. So these are some of the other products that they, also pickled vegetables. And they're not only important as income generators, but they are the kind of glue that holds together families. Because migrants who come back, they eat these products, and they're also given these products to take back with them. So they're also a way, of course, in terms of social glue, of involving family members in the production of these, different kinds of, products. And sometimes, like an elderly parent will come from Magdalena and come back to San Ignacio and help with the production. Or a migrant relative might give the jars to his mother to produce these, because he works in Walmart in Nogales and he gets them for a discounted rate there. Okay, so these kinds of arrangements, even cross-border arrangements, show that it's really not only about income production, but also about this kind of social glue. However, this production is being challenged by climate change. And so when we look at the effects of climate change, we have to look at why is it important to look by gender at what people know about in agricultural production and processing. Well, one of the things I use is a feminist political ecology approach to do that. And it places importance on the different types of knowledge possessed and transmitted also by different social actors. The social, i.e. gender, age, ethnicity, and race, and physical locations of these actors are all examined to gain a better understanding of how these social positionings influence knowledge and the ability to use this knowledge to gain political voice and decision-making power in general. Now, post-harvest processing stages of agricultural development rarely figure into agricultural policies. And so I look then at this post-harvest process and look at it in terms of gender knowledge, but I also look at agricultural production itself that takes place in home compounds as something that needs to be looked at from a gender lens, but also from the perspective that it's something that contributes to food production and income. So what's happening in terms of climate change is that there's a growing depletion of water, surface water in the river, but also importantly in these springs that are near the river and are linked again hydrologically to the river. And that's where they irrigate from, is these springs. They channel it into canals and then use it to irrigate their orchards. In the home compounds, what they tend to use is tap water. But where does that tap water come from? Well, that's a well near a river, okay? And they've had to deepen their well, and in the paper you can see that they've had to deepen their wells by about 130 feet recently in the last 6 months, okay? So this means this drawdown of water resources is really affecting production in not only in the fields, but also in these home compounds. So what are women doing then? Well, they're doing a number of different things to respond to this crisis. They're reintroducing tree species such as plums in home compounds as an experiment. These were wiped out less than 10 years ago due to a pest. And as we know, with climate change, pests can wreak more damage because the plant or tree in this case is weakened already due to higher temperatures, less rainfall, right? It's weaker. So any pest that comes through, it can literally wipe it out. And that's what happened with plum production. They produced 4 different types in this region. It was wiped out in about 3 years. Okay, so, but the women decided that let's try. Enough years have passed. Let's try in our home compounds to reintroduce plums. Let's see what happens. And the men were skeptical, but very interested, looking to see. It takes a while, 3 years, for the fruits to start, coming onto the trees. And so this summer, the plum trees began to produce their first fruits. And the women were, cheering, and the men were interested and thinking, well, still there's very small production. Let's see what happens next year. But you might see then the reintroduction of plums into this region. Now, what had happened before is they adapted by producing more quince jelly when the plums were wiped out. So there are these kinds of adaptive processes, right, that are not necessarily linear. And women are trying to maintain a diversity of agricultural crops in the area. So the other thing that they do is they purchase inputs like olives and quince from communities in the region that maybe weren't affected by some of the pests that were affecting their region. They alter water sources and water storage methods. So let me give you an example of one woman who irrigates her land right in her home compound with tap water. And so what she did was she grew a variety of different, like cilantro, chilies, green beans, to be able to make this pickled vegetable product. Okay, so, and she also runs a small nursery in this same very small home compound. So what she did was she has an overhead tank that she's had on there for about 60 years on her roof. And she stores the tap water there so that she has enough tap water to be able to irrigate her home compound. Well, what happened was that there was a strong freeze this last winter. So the tank basically got damaged. So she could no longer use it. So she had to then enter into an agreement with her neighbor who has a well to carry water to her home compound, and then with buckets, then she and her husband irrigated the home compound crops. So what she decided to do then is basically, next year, only after fixing the tank, which is an economic difficulty for this couple, to only store water in the warmer months in that tank. Again, this tank has been on the rooftop for over 50 years, okay? But this is an adaptive strategy that they're going to have to do. They also had to replant all of their crops and the saplings because all died this summer because there wasn't enough rainfall. And They didn't have the extra water in their tank, and they didn't have enough water coming from their neighbor. Okay, so that's just one example, and they're also diversifying their income sources. So Rosa, for example, also sells candies that her son gets for her in Costco in Tucson. And then she sells them by the piece. Okay, let's focus now on Rayon and cheese production. So, moving to Rayon, we see, again, located on the San Miguel River. Women make two types of cheeses, but one is commercialized, marketed. That is the queso cocido, or cooked cheese. And they make it, again, with family members. And again, it's very important in social networks, because migrants who come back, one woman told me, who's a migrant and was visiting, if I go to Rayon and I don't eat cheese, it's as if I haven't even been to Rayon. So, you know, the importance of cheese can't be overestimated. They have it in quesadillas mainly, and they, in any fiesta or any holiday, they basically sit around and eat quesadillas, and also, of course, barbecues. So this is how it's produced in their homes, usually right in their homes. Sometimes they'll have an extra room right next to their home. And these are the small stoves that they have with gas, run by gas, and then they're put into these small buckets or pails, and then they're stored in freezers. Now, the cheese culture is sensitive to weather. It will get killed. It's a bacteria, so it gets killed in very cold or very hot temperatures. And so what they're doing is, because of more extreme climate, they are experiencing this die-off of their culture more frequently. So they do share the culture between friends and especially relatives. So one woman said, yeah, I just go to my sister-in-law, and she will lend me some culture. She will give me some culture if mine dies. But as the problem became more severe, with more severe weather, they've begun to add citric acid, which helps to also acidify the cheese and helps to combat this problem, mitigate the problem of this culture that is dying. Some similarities is that there are collaborations between family members. The farming and ranching in larger land parcels is overseen by male household members. But one difference is that agricultural production is taking place in Rayon, not within the home compound. So it's taking place, though, in irrigated land, rain-fed land, and also in the monte, which is the wilds, wildlands, if you can call it, around the community. And it is there that you're finding also the impact of climate change, and that's really not in the focus, again, of any government policies or programs or nonprofit organizations. And that's similar to what Neil was saying, is that wild foods, whether it's for cattle or whether it's for people, are not really considered to be agriculture. They're not considered to be part of the whole livelihood system, but they're very important. And what's happening is, with the winters becoming colder, they're having unprecedented freezes of these wild plants and plants, especially in trees, that the cattle are feeding on in the monte. And so this is affecting dairy production, okay? Because this is what the animals eat for that part of the year where they're in the monte, okay? So again, it's these spaces of production that are not included in government policies or programs, but that are being impacted by climate change and that are then impacting agricultural processing activities, in this case cheese. There's also a decline in the linked groundwater and surface water sources. So in Rayón, I was luckily there when they were deepening the well, and everybody was very glad because they were getting water cuts in their homes, and this was in May of this year. So I asked the engineer who was actually staying in the same hotel, I said, so how much deeper is this well than the one before that it's replacing for drinking water? And he said it's 130 feet deeper. Okay. So that's significant, and it's a drilled well, not a dug well, and so you need more power, of course, to pump that water up, right? And it also points to, and this is why I like using ecological systems frameworks, is it's pointing to possible ecological tipping points in terms of groundwater use. How much deeper can you really drill and still have it be economically feasible to engage in this production? Now, one of the things that the women are doing is that they're buying milk from elsewhere. Since with all of this going on, people are either decreasing herd size, or they're getting out of farming altogether. They still need milk for these productive enterprises like cheese production. And so what they're doing is they are purchasing milk, but from quite far away, from as far away as Garbo, which is in the, it's on the very bad road, 45 minutes away. And this, of course, implies gasoline costs, which many are complaining about, and time of family members. It's either the women themselves or maybe a son or daughter that might go to get the milk. But it's a way of kind of separating agricultural production and processing that they're engaging in. So let me just read you, how many more minutes do I have, by the way?
You actually have 7 more minutes.
7 more minutes, perfect. Okay, thank you. Let me introduce you to Silvia. Silvia is a woman who is someone who's a real go-getter, and she produces the most cheese in the community. She's even gotten her own label, which has her name on it. She's been recognized not only within Sonora, but in the whole of Northwest Mexico for her cheese, in a government kind of promotion of cheese. She has also obtained funding from a government program, Alianza para el Campo, to purchase burners to be able to produce more cheese at a time, and freezers to be able to store more cheese before selling it. She received assistance to build an additional room that's connected to her house to produce the cheese. And for both grants, she received half of the cost of labor and materials. She explains how she got the chief of the irrigation district, who was attending a meeting in the municipal office in Rayón, to come to her house and look at the space that she used for cheese production, to show him that she produced a large volume of cheese and needed the equipment and extra space necessary to be able to expand her business. She explained, he was in the meeting and I grabbed him and I pulled him to my house to show him that my production was large. She noted that the percentage that the government gives now has been greatly reduced. So she also innovates by adding different flavors to the cheese, and she proudly says that she was the first one to do that in Rayón, and that other people have now started to do that too. She has other ideas about what to do with her business, and one of them is that she wants to reduce her energy costs. And she said that there was a government program, and one man came to her business And it was to provide 50% to install solar panels. But she said the government officials did not return here. They only finally decided to provide them for communities in Sonora and the mountains where there is no electricity. Studies on gender and climate change have shown that women are more receptive to green energy sources and as such can act as climate change mitigation forces. So that's Silvia, and it points to some of the things that women have done. She buys her a lot of her milk in Garabal. Why? Because the well that they had, she and her husband, it no longer provides them with any water. So it was not deep enough, and they didn't have the money to deepen it. It's hugely costly. It's about almost $8,000 to deepen a well. Okay, so they no longer have irrigated agriculture. So what they do is they let their the few cows that they have remaining out in the monte, but they also let them out in the rain-fed lands, which are grown with buffalo grass, which is an introduced species. I can see some nodding heads. And that has been considered to be a scourge because with climate change it does very well. It loves that dry weather and it spreads, and unfortunately it can actually take over. It's an invasive species. But it does very well for feed, and that's why people continue to cultivate it, and it can withstand very dry conditions. But even the buffalo grass has been affected by the frosts, and so it grows much more slowly, the ranchers are saying. Now, the other thing that the women have been doing is they've been doing increasingly creative and modernized marketing. So this woman that I just explained to you, she now uses the internet to get orders. So this is very recent. And so she takes orders ahead of time from her clients in Hermosillo, but also in Garabal. Also people just knowing that they're going to visit Rayon. She told me, next time you come, Stephanie, you just send me an email and I'll have that cheese that you like with mushrooms. Okay? So the other thing is that they're just putting the cheese on buses that then takes it to Hermosillo, so they don't have to go themselves to Hermosillo, the capital city. And then they have somebody, and sometimes it's a relative, a migrant relative, pick that cheese up, and then they sell it. Okay? And sometimes they're just vendors who they have this contractual arrangement with. So that's another method that they've tried to broaden the regional scope of their marketing. They try to procure government assistance for production expansion, and in the paper I talk about that they have been more successful than the women in San Ignacio at getting government assistance. But all have said that government assistance is actually, there's less of it, and what you get is actually less now. And livelihood diversification. So one of the main things that they're trying to do is educate their children to a much higher degree than they were educated. But this in Rayon has meant this brain drain towards Hermosillo. And it has also meant that this kind of processing is not being passed on to the next generation. Just when we need more food to feed more people on this earth. So we need to connect the dots between these different production spaces where agricultural production is taking place. We need to connect those with agricultural processing that is taking place that preserves that food in a way that will make it last throughout the year, for example, and feeds urban populations too, and rural populations. And we need to recognize that there is gendered knowledge of climate change effects on agriculture, and also climate change effects on agricultural processing, but also adaptation strategies. And we may be at an ecological tipping point in terms of groundwater use, and there needs to be kind of a stakeholder meetings across watersheds to figure out what to do about that, because right now it's a possibility to buy milk from Garbo, but what happens when those wells are depleted, right? You can't go even further. For one thing, you'd have to have refrigerated trucks, which they don't have. And so the viability then of agriculture and agricultural processing is at stake. And of course, this world's ability to provide food for its growing population hangs in the balance. Thank you. So I hope that when it does come out, that you'll all take a look at this book that I'm working on with a former graduate student of mine, Anne Marie Hansen, who is now at Trinity College and who is working with me. We have case studies from around the world on women, water, and global environmental change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So let's open the floor to discussion specific to this great talk, and then after a little bit we'll segue into a broader discussion that will also include Dr. Flora, who I'll call up here, and we can have a broader discussion about cross-cutting themes. But first off, let's give due attention to your great talk.
As far as the goods that are like the pickled vegetables and the candied fruits and the cheeses, is that a niche market for these home producers, or are they competing directly with bigger corporations? And if they are, how has that balance shifted with the climate change? Has it affected the corporations as well, or does it mean that the niche market is being squashed?
Yeah, we're all part of the same ecosystem, so it is affecting larger corporations as well, the sources of the products that they buy as well. Just like Levi's is being impacted by climate change effects on cotton, right? But this is a niche market in the sense that it is, it's very symbolic because it signifies home. So for the growing number of people who do not live in their home villages, this is something that brings them home. So they actually take these products with them back to Hermosillo or to Magdalena or wherever they're living in the U.S. It's like all of us have our specialties that we grew up with and that we love and we associate it with home. But it also brings people together within these communities. And I've written other work that questions, what will happen when we have these kinds of more non-capitalist forms of production losing out to more capitalist forms of production, and where reciprocity isn't part of social systems in these communities. And this is part of a whole network. People give these as gifts to people in these communities. And then other people give other gifts back to people who they've received gifts from. So it's part of a whole social network in these communities. And it's part of really, in many ways, a whole separate economy. And so that, of course, is very linked to also the capitalist economy because they are getting an income from this in selling this. But it has much more value than just as a source of income, and that's what might be lost.
Katie.
Can you speak to, I was sort of fascinated by the cheesemaker story, and I'm just wondering whether there's something contradictory going on if a woman is being encouraged to expand her production at a time when the resources are diminished.
Yeah. And I think that, well, for one thing, there isn't as much government assistance for anything. And even for another of the cases in the paper is of a cheesemaker who also got money to put up a small hotel and just rooms, and so that kind of thing where you're encouraging livelihood diversification is also very valuable for the people here, because then they're not only depending on one product, but they've never depended only on one product. It's just that their other livelihood activities didn't provide much of an income, and some of them are being lost now.
Dr. Buchler, I think you've done a great job in showing how women are resourceful and adaptive. Did they talk to you to any extent about the degree to which it is fair that they have to be so resourceful in the face of, basically bear the burden of these climate changes?
Well, I think that points to policy failure, that basically these spaces and these processes are not being recognized. And so that because they're not being recognized, then women are part of an invisible economy almost, that is not receiving support. And so I think that's the whole climate justice angle on this. And it's something that they themselves say that, that they want to get some of these types of assistance to be able to earn a better income and to have their children remain at home. For example, one woman hopes that her one daughter might be able to take on the business of the hotel rather than following the rest of the 4 daughters who are in Hermosillo. And she's running her ranch alone now because she's a widowed woman, and does the hotel business as well. So there's a bigger and bigger burden also with male migration on women. And so I think that if we think about who is producing the food that people are eating in rural and urban areas, and who's producing also employment, these vendors in urban areas who are selling these products, whether it's the canned fruits or the cheese, they're providing employment also not only for rural areas but for urban peoples as well. And so in order for government programs to tackle employment but also food security, they need to think about these unconventional maybe spaces and production processes.
So we keep talking about the gender knowledge, but it seems to me as if this might be more, or not more related. There's a covariance between this and decentralization of industrial strategies and industrial approaches, right? I guess I wanted to know what kind of typifies the other end of the spectrum. What would be masculine knowledge or something like that, or more male-centric knowledge? Is it the same as a centralized industry? Is that what represents male-centric approaches, or is there something deeper that I didn't see?
Well, you have to look at each community, and it's very context-specific. Local knowledge always is. And again, it has to do with which spaces are you talking about. So if you're looking at ranching for meat production, that's very male-dominated. Actually, there's a student looking at that on the project, and so he's looking at herd sizes and what they're doing in response to climate change related to the number of cattle owned. And he probably will be talking to 99% men. And also, so these spaces are gendered, but I mean, the montes is mainly where men, inhabit. So, And, they let their cattle out, and you'll see suddenly on the road, and you think, where did this person come from? Riding their horses, and they're, basically shepherding cows in the monte. And these cowboys, and basically this monte is not irrigated agriculture. It's also not rain-fed agriculture. But it's being deeply impacted by climate change. And what they're doing is they're buying more, and I talk about this in the paper, they're buying more alfalfa packs or bales. And that is virtual water. So it's grown elsewhere with irrigation, right? Alfalfa takes a lot of water. And then it's shipped to Rayon and then sold as feed for cattle. And that's supplanting then the wild plants and trees that they used to eat in the monte that didn't need any irrigation, and in fact were not even tilled. It's wilds. So that's one of the strategies that they're engaging in. They're also deepening their wells, but how long, again, you can do that for is questionable and still have it be economically feasible. So many men I talked to said, well, again, this points to maybe possible ecological tipping points of like, well, we're going to give it another 2 years, or some people have said even 1 year, and then if it doesn't get better, we're going to move in with our kids in Hermosillo. Yeah, so.
All right, well, it may be time to invite Dr. Fleur to join the panel, to make a panel. And I encourage all of you to think about some of the themes that cut across the talks, so that we can think kind of broadly about some of the issues that both of them touch on. If I may kick it off, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you kind of conceptualize the role that larger political and economic processes play. Mm-hmm. The sense I have from both of your talks is that you acknowledge the importance of things like neoliberal policies and broader political economic processes, but kind of conceptualize them as compounding or amplifying the impacts of climate change, to which then people must adapt. But ultimately, the emphasis and the analytical focus is on the adaptation to climate change having been amplified by these larger structures. Is that right?
Well, what I see is there is the policies are contested terrain, particularly the amplification policies, and I mentioned they're particularly contested by indigenous groups. They're highly supported by urban groups. So you have this, so you do have contestation in a political field, and I mentioned that you see indigenous groups disassociating from political parties, which I think is terribly interesting and terribly important. I think the other interesting piece, one of your questions struck me is, do women think it's fair that they're adapting? That people have a view that this is what they've done all their lives. The place where you hear fairness mentioned is more on the geopolitical area. Evo Morales is saying it's not fair to expect us to do all the mitigation because you guys are creating all the problems. So we have I don't want to call it a rhetoric, but a rhetoric of fairness, I will call it that, a rhetoric of fairness around payment for ecological services on an international basis that can become very interesting in terms of policies, both nationally and internationally. So we take it from a community level as given, and sort of how do we push back and try to, how do communities push back, and particularly through adaptation coalitions, attempt to utilize and turn existing policies toward successful locality adaptations. But we're also seeing other groups becoming, again, more strongly pushing back, saying, no, maybe this model is not right. And I see it again in this movement that is actually taken up by even non-indigenous groups in Latin America. And I will not use the Aymara word. I will say it's called bien vivir or vivir bien. I mean, buen vivir or vivir bien. And this is a really interesting social movement that is growing, that is kind of rejecting the consumption ethic of what they see developmentalism and the new developmentalism imposing, and trying to say, maybe we look at alternative models. It has not reached national policy yet, but at least we're seeing some interesting pushback.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we just need to think, especially when we're looking at migration, of the larger picture of what is causing people to migrate. And you hear a lot of discussion of, climate migration and climate-related migration. And I think that, so policies have to look at the larger picture of what is causing people to migrate and what can we do about it, and whose role is important. And I think it's all of our, it's all of us that need to be thinking about this so that people can remain in their communities if they choose to do that, and can become educated within their communities, and then live productive lives within their communities if they choose to do that. And so I think that it needs to be at multiple levels that we work together on these kinds of solutions. So employment-related solutions, education, it has to include health, it has to include from various different angles that we're working together, skill building, but also traditional knowledge. One of my favorite examples of a recent conversation I had with a farmer in his orchard was that what he did with this problem was he had javelinas, which are these wild pigs, destroy part of his nopal leaf production. These are cactus leaves that are cooked, and they're very nutritious actually, and eaten all around Mexico. And so what he does is he just plants an extra row, and that's for them. And he said that, now, people are recognizing the nutritional value of nopalitos, and so he wants to expand his production. And he said, but I'll always keep a row for the javelinas. So it's living with nature rather than fighting it.
I'm really pleased. I was expecting you to say he'd organize a javelina hunt for the urban farm hunters, so this is really good.
So I think Stephanie addressed a little bit when you were talking about migration patterns, and when people are unable to adaptate. And I was very interested because you give us, both of you give us very interesting examples of how women's and indigenous groups have adapted against the impacts of climate change. But I'm wondering about those, the poorest of the poor, people who are unable, who can't really adaptate. And I don't know if you have seen, or within your research, you have identified, I know you mentioned some of like migration, moving to Hermosillo, but I'm wondering also with Flora, like, if you can maybe give us some more examples, like, what happened to those people, and if you have seen any actions or ways to transfer those adaptations, mechanisms or strategies for those who are unable right now to change.
I'm going to give a Mexican example because we looked at transnational communities between a Mexican sending town in Michoacan to a receiving meatpacking town in Iowa. And we did it by generations of women. We were interested in women. And what we found was the most vulnerable group were the older women who did not migrate, who might not have children that migrated. And this is where we saw the difficulties in adapting, because they had previously adapted. They used a lot of wild food. The nopales were one of them that they used from the monte that was around the village. But then the folks who were working in the US sent back Green Revolution technology, so people would plant corn, put on a ton of herbicides, there goes the wild food. So we saw that the adaptation strategies that had said, I'm going to use this ecosystem to make up for the fact I have no monetary income, was being destroyed through modern solutions. Another really interesting study there was a man had his children migrated and they were going to get him a truck. He said, I don't need a truck. I have my horse, I have my dogs. He said, no, we'll get you a truck. So they got him a truck. But he didn't want to buy the gasoline. He didn't want to learn to drive. So the truck sits there. And he still takes his horse to go to his fields. His dogs come with him. And he's really happy about that. And he saved a heck of a lot of money and saved the planet at the same time. So you see these interesting sort of resistance to a modernization push that says, no, we can adapt. But again, what the sad thing is how the modernization push can destroy those very intricate adaptations that were occurring.
Yeah, my question for both of you goes a little bit into, I love both studies, and a little bit on how much awareness are in different sections. In the rural areas first, it's like, are these people aware that they are being victims of the climate change, or they perceive it as like a continuation of a life that has been hard over the centuries, because that is what it is, and then they have been adopted for a long time now. And the other question goes to the cities. It seems to be a huge gap between the rural areas and the urban areas that absorbed, and then they absorb all what they produce and absorb even the human beings, like the young people. And in the cities is where not only all these values of consumerism are reproduced, but also where universities have a seat. Do the universities recognize themselves as a possible subject in all these scheme? What is happening there? Not to go to the administration, the politicians, that we have talked about how they contaminate the different movements. So how do they see these studies that you are doing? Do they know about it, or they don't prefer not to have any connection?
I'm going to give you an example from the Amazon that is really interesting. It's the Amazon area of Peru, it's in the region of Cusco, but it's in the Amazon. And these are two communities we looked at. We looked at two island communities, two Amazon communities, one of them highly impacted by the petroleum industry, the other not so much so, but both impacted by climate change. And rather than seeing themselves as victims, these people who were highly tied to that Amazon area said, this is probably partially our fault. We have forgotten our relations with our ancestors and the forest. We need to be more mindful. It was almost, and they weren't exactly blaming themselves, but they were saying, we need to take responsibility for it. So rather than seeing themselves as victim, interesting enough, by saying, I am partially responsible because I wasn't mindful. My cosmovision had strayed. But if I go back to that, I can begin to cure this. But so the point there is, when you are a victim, you give up your agency. What I'm seeing when you say, I am responsible simply by my spiritual negligence, you are taking agency on, and you are making yourself a positive actor. And when you do this collectively, this can be really important. So I was very surprised at that, because it would be so easy. I live in a state where a lot of my agriculturalists see themselves as constant victims. The EPA, all these evil people who are trying to take away their profits. So I found that a very surprising reaction. I also find that in Peru, the current university we're working most with, oddly enough, and I'm going to name two universities, is in Chachapoyas, which is in the region of Amazonias, but which should not be confused with the Amazon basin. And they have a really interesting program in basically sustainable development. And they're really aware of climate change, they're aware of, they are being impacted in Amazonas with the immigrants that are being forced out of Cajamarca by the mining. So you have people come in doing horrible things agriculturally as they're attempting to make a new life someplace else and don't know the ecosystem. So I'm seeing that university doing some really interesting, it's a small university, it's not very important. I've worked for a long time with La Molina in Lima, and there's at least a part there that's really taking this very seriously. I am going to go and be Dean of the Graduate School in Education at CATIE, which is a Centro para la Investigación y Estudios en Agricultura Tropical, and that is an area which takes this very, very seriously. So you see these very interesting pockets of progressiveness around universities, but these are not, La Molina didn't used to be urban, now it is. When I first worked, I'm old enough that when I first started working with La Molina, it was out in the countryside. Now it's urban all the way, but at any rate, but we need to see more, I think, urban universities taking on this burden of mitigation as well as adaptation.
Yeah, on this project, Unison and Golson are involved, the Colegio de Sonora and the Universidad de Sonora, and also a woman who was at the Colegio de Sonora. She is now a student at the University of Arizona getting her PhD in arid lands, and she and I are going to begin working together in January on some separate issues but related to dairy production. And so what I found is that so far studies have focused mainly on sort of the meat production angle, which doesn't cover all of the production certainly that's taking place, and actually more milk is produced than meat. And some of the dairy cows then are sold for meat after they get to be older, right? So it's not completely divorced from one another, these types of productions, but systems. But, you know, there's this romantic idea of the man on the, you know, horse with the sombrero, and you know, that is an important part of both sides of the border, of meat production on the border. But actually in some of these communities, you find that dairy production is actually more important to the economy, and then processing that milk. Many people I talk to don't even drink milk, they just eat the cheese, so it's a very important source of food in these communities.
Go ahead. Katie, yes.
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I was interested as you were talking about the land grabbing issues and government redistributing land to corporations and mining and things like that, interests and things like that, that, I don't know, in the description that you gave, although it's a kind of structural violence, it didn't include actual violence that seems to be happening in some places, along with the issues with climate, etc. Could you maybe speak about that in your research sites, whether that's an aspect of the
So how do you maintain social control when what people do see as unfair is not the climate change. They see being unfair being forced off their land. That is very much defined as unfair and as illegitimate and as something worth protesting. And when you seriously protest it, and particularly in Cajamarca, is a place adjacent to, this is not one of my study sites, but it's a place where we worked in conjunction with what we do in Amazonas, is a place where you see some specific violence. And people are very concerned that you're going to totally wipe out one lake to make a mining dump that will wipe out everybody's livelihood, you know, for huge amounts of areas. And at that point, the mining company, who has basic territorial control, because they're paying a lot of money to the government of Peru, is in fact using physical violence to maintain that. But they're only using physical violence when people object to being forced off their land and losing their livelihood and losing their way of life. But there is actual violence going on. But again, it is framed as mining. If we don't have mining, we don't have money. No payment, no subsidies if there's not mining. So again, until we have people say no, there are alternatives, until we get people talking about no, there are other possibilities, we're going to see that. And boy, destroying water sources. Another case of this where there is no violence, again in the Chachapoyas area, is the Moron River Dam that is basically financed by Brazil, that basically will provide hydropower that will go not to the local area that really needs it, which is the argument for having it. It will go to the major investments of Brazil in that area. So again, there's these really interesting water grabs, land grabs that have local people protesting, but the government is saying, hey, we're making money on this, and we're giving some of the money we make back to poor people. So how can you object?
All right, I'm going to give myself the last question. Why? Because I know a lot of people have to leave at 3, and what I want to do is, first of all, give you a chance, don't forget to do this, fill this out, but also in the 15 minutes that should remain, you may have specific questions for the speakers, and I want to give you a chance to kind of chat with them informally before many have to leave at 3. So if both of you had to offer one strategy for action, we have undergrads here, and you know, undergrads and grad students want to know what they can do, right? What can we do here that can address a lot of the issues that you brought up around climate fairness, bearing the burden of climate change? If you were to suggest one strategy, what would it be? Kind of an opportunity for intervention or action.
Yeah.
Well, what I'm encouraging my students to do in this new Masters in Development Practice program that we have, and I encourage you to get the pamphlets here, I'll make a plug for it, is to first get to know the issues right in your backyard. So don't think that this is an issue that you have to, you know, take a summer, you know, program to learn about. Before you do that summer program, get to know the issues in your backyard. Then you can keep going back, right, to that area. You can keep, conversing with the people that, you know, you're learning from, and become friends with them. So go back once a week, twice a week, however many times you can go back and learn from them what they're doing in your community gardens. If you're interested in agriculture, that's what I'm doing in Tucson. And if you're interested in issues related to the environment and environmental degradation, you can go to communities affected by water pollution and that kind of thing. Find out what they're doing and listen. And then go to other areas that maybe you're doing your PhD research in, or you're doing your thesis research in. And already you'll have the practice of listening and learning. And you can sometimes then even be able to think about ways of tackling these issues in these other areas that the people talk about in other areas in your own backyard. But keep going back when you go to your research sites, keep going back to the same households. Always establish key households that you go back to. And those people will become your friends for life, maybe. But they'll also teach you a lot about how they're adapting over time, because these are processes. It's not one adaptation and then you're set, because environmental change doesn't stop. And so you basically have to know what people are doing over a long period of time.
Well, I think that was brilliant and can add very little, but to sum it up in terms of social capital. And one of the things you can do as students is create your own social capital with various groups that are experiencing the brunt of climate change or are working very hard to mitigate it and adapt to it. And you can form those relationships, but you can also be a bridge among groups that might not otherwise talk to each other. You have a convening power because of your relationship with this university that can allow you to bring people together who might not otherwise be talking to each other, and I think that's really important. So try to do this by talking to someone who you know you really disagree with. Try to figure out what are the terms where you can have an agreement. So keep working on that, particularly around areas of climate change, which I suspect your state is kind of like my state, where a lot of people say, well, it's not happening, and if it is, we had nothing to do with it. So where are places you can come to agreement and begin working in those areas, because ultimately it's going to have to be a very collaborative process.
All right, well, please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you all, and don't forget these forms. That's right, really great advice.